A very warm welcome to everyone tuning into today's webinar on common mistakes in cross-cultural negotiation. My name is Patricia Cheong and I'm the Associate Director for Development for PCMA Asia Pacific in Singapore. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to come and learn with us today. We're very excited to have with us here Craig Shim, who is the Director and Founder of Alphacrane Intercultural Specialists, who is leading today's webinar. Craig will also be at AIME in Melbourne, sharing this session at the Knowledge Program, curated by PCMA on the 18th of February, so please do join us then if you can. So now, without further ado, I'm going to hand the time over to Craig, who I know is really excited to start sharing his presentation with you. Hi, Craig, good morning. How are you?
I'm well, thanks Patricia, and thanks for that warm introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar. Now, let's imagine that you are ready to negotiate a business deal with an Australian supplier or an Asian buyer. Now, you've already started your discussions, they're going well, but after a while, you start to notice that they are losing interest and perhaps not looking to continue pursuing the deal. So eventually, you're left wondering what went wrong. Well, that's the challenge that we're going to be unpacking today. And in this webinar, what I'd like to do is to share with you some common pitfalls of cross-cultural negotiation. And I'll be sharing with you some tips so that you can avoid making some of those mistakes yourselves. Now, my name is Craig Shim. One of the services that I provide is cross-cultural negotiation advice to international businesses and to government organisations. And in my international experience, I've come across quite a number of highly competent negotiators who just seem to, well, come unstuck when it comes to their cross-cultural negotiations. And more often than not, it's down to a few fairly basic mistakes. Just to give you some background, for all of the programs that I run, whether they are coaching sessions or workshops or training sessions, I use a methodology called scenario-based learning. And for this webinar, this is how it works. I will read out to you the scenario. I will then pose to you a question, which I would like you to answer by the end of the webinar. And the scenario, this particular scenario is focused on the MICE sector. And for those of you who are not aware what that stands for, MICE is an acronym for meetings, incentives, conventions, and exhibitions. But if you're not from the MICE sector, don't worry, the topics that we're going to cover off today certainly are relevant regardless of which industry you're from, and also which cultures that you are dealing with. So let me read out the scenario for you now. A large Chinese MICE agent approaches a local Australian event management company to handle an incentive group of over 300 people to Australia. The Chinese client asks plenty of detailed questions. The Australian supplier sources the information and responds in a timely manner. However, additional requests for information ensue, requiring significantly more time and effort than what the Australian supplier would typically provide prior to having a contract signed. So now for the question. What advice would you give either party so they can negotiate the best outcomes? So what I invite you to do now is, if you have any comments or ideas, please put them into the chat column, and at the end of the webinar, we will have some time to go through your comments. Similarly, if you've got any questions, feel free to put them into the chat section, and we'll address those later on as well. But for now, before we go into the solutions section, let's pause and think about what's really going on here. That is really important when it comes to particularly complicated negotiations like this one. So let's have a look at things from an Asian perspective. And the question that I would pose to pose to you now is, at this point, you probably want to ask yourself, what is the primary objective of the person with whom you are negotiating with? It may seem like a simple question, but you'll be surprised as to what the answer may be in some cases. in this particular scenario, what the Australian party or the Australian supplier may not realise is that the Asian buyer's focus or objective at this point in time is probably on building a long-term relationship with a reliable Australian local supplier that they can do business with for the next 20 years. So from an Asian perspective, they probably want to get either a foothold into Australia, which requires them to have a reliable, trustworthy partner, or if they are already operating in Australia, perhaps they want to increase their market share. So what the Australian may not realise is that the focus, the objective from the Asian's perspective is definitely on securing a good relationship. Now, the other thing that the Australian may or may not realise is that the Asian party at this point of time hasn't actually won the bid. So what they are doing is that they are probably responding to a request for a proposal from their own clients, and they're obviously trying to collate as much information as possible so that they can put in a good bid. During this process, they obviously will be trying to secure or establish, I should say, a relationship with their own clients so that they can glean some insights that will help them to formulate a really strong business proposal. Once they get those insights, they will quickly forward those over to the Australian supplier, and that's probably in the form of a whole list of additional questions that they hadn't thought of earlier. But here's the problem. If the Australian supplier then starts to come back and say, look, we've already given you some answers and we're not really prepared to give you any more, from the Asian's perspective, they might be thinking, well, have we really got the right business partner here? Number one, they don't seem to understand how things are done in Asia. And number two, they don't seem particularly concerned about establishing a long-term relationship. So you can see in terms of what's going on, that's perhaps what's going on in the minds of the Asian buyer. Let's have a look at the other side. From the Australian's perspective, what the Asian buyer may not realise is that the Australian is very much focused at this particular point in time in getting the contract signed. And that's because from an Australian perspective, negotiation is a fairly systematic process, and one of those key milestones is getting the contract signed. After that contract is signed, then the Australian supplier is more likely to invest more time in building the relationship and continuing to provide some more detailed information. But it is really a case of doing things step by step. And from the Asian's perspective, they may not actually realize that. So these are a couple of things to keep in mind when we talk about what's going on. I'll just quickly flash onto the screen here again the scenario, the script of the scenario, in case you were wondering about any of those points. But what I'd like to do now is to move on to some of the common mistakes that I have seen across intercultural or cross-cultural negotiations. And the first mistake that I would like to share is focusing too heavily on those lists of do's and don'ts. So for those of you who have prepared for intercultural or cross-cultural negotiations before, no doubt you have come across those lists of all the things that you should do and all the things that you shouldn't do. Now, I'm not downplaying the fact that these things are important, but I would argue that if you focus too heavily on those, you are missing the bigger picture in terms of really understanding what the underlying needs and wants are, what the underlying business mindset is of the person with whom you are negotiating. When it comes to those lists of do's and don'ts, more often than not, they tend to focus on things like local customs or business etiquette. But here's something for you to consider. Understanding business culture is much more than just local etiquette and business customs. These are what we refer to as visible culture. Visible culture. So it's just the tip of the surface. But as I mentioned earlier, what we are more interested in is really understanding their business mindset. And this is what we refer to as invisible culture. And it covers off things like values, attitudes, expectations, and it's really about understanding their needs and wants. But how do we know if we haven't yet met that person or we haven't got a relationship with them yet, how do we know what their underlying business mindset is? Well, I've got a really helpful intercultural framework that I'd like to share with you, which is a really, to me, a good way, a good starting point of trying to preempt what that business mindset might be. Now, this model is by a renowned interculturalist by the name of Richard Lewis, and I like to use this as a starting point for categorizing cultures. And here's how it works. There are a whole lot of countries that are mapped around this triangle here, and they're really categorized into 3 different areas. On the bottom left-hand side are what we refer to as the linear active cultures. And these are cultures where there is a fairly strong emphasis on doing things step by step or systematically. And in the context of this particular scenario, the Australian, and Australia does fall into this circle here, about 4 circles up from the bottom left-hand side, the Australian is really focused on getting the contract signed and going through a very systematic process of negotiation. If you have a look at the countries that are in this circle here, on the bottom left-hand side is Germany, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and if you think about the types of industries that they really excel in, these are industries where they really have to rely on doing things systematically and are quite process-driven. In terms of communication style, people from these cultures tend to be fairly direct in comparison to people from different cultural backgrounds. Now that brings me to an interesting point here. The purpose of this, the purpose of categorizing cultures is not to stereotype. It's not to say that all Germans are very direct, they're very process-driven, and they're very systematic. What it does is, or what the purpose of this model is to compare 2 or more cultures. 2 or more cultures. So it's all relative. Now, let's have a look at the cultures at the top of the triangle, the multi-active cultures. They are quite different from the linear active cultures in the sense that rather than having a strong focus on doing things step by step, they are more used to doing things, they are more used to doing many things at once. And the driving motivator behind this is relationships, making sure that there is a good relationship in place. In the context of negotiating, it means that in these cultures, you are unlikely to even get to discuss a deal until you have a good business relationship, a genuine relationship in place at the beginning. If you have a look at the countries here, these are all your Latin countries. So for example, Spain, Italy, and your South American countries. If you think about their communication style compared with the linear active cultures, they tend to be louder. They certainly tend to be more emotive, more expressive, and in a business situation, quite often it is acceptable for people to be talking over one another. So that's the multi-active cultures, but what we are most interested for today are the reactive cultures, and these are the cultures at the bottom right-hand side of this triangle. These are your Asian cultures. They have a lot in similar with the multi-active cultures in that they are also heavily relationship-driven. But the big difference here is that from an Asian perspective, when it comes to relationships, they are very focused on maintaining group harmony and saving face. So that has big implications when it comes to communication styles, whereby instead of talking a lot or instead of talking over one another, they will tend to spend more time listening. And their purpose of listening is to try to understand or preempt what the other person's position might be on a particular topic, especially when it comes to potentially controversial topics, so that when they react, they can react in a way that is not going to disrupt that group harmony. As a result, there tends to be a lot more time listening, and when it comes to negotiating, there will tend to be periods of time when there are silence, which indicates that they're thinking, they're contemplating, and that can be quite confronting if you're from another cultural background where you are used to constantly talking and jumping in there with ideas. That can be quite off-putting. So in terms of the communication style, rather than being direct like the linear active cultures, there is a much stronger focus on being diplomatic. So that's the Lewis model. What I'd like to do now is to pose a question to you to consider, keeping in mind this Lewis model for categorizing cultures. And here's the question: how might you advise either party to demonstrate trustworthiness? So this really comes down to the business mindset. So I invite you to please write your comments into the chat section right now, and you know, read each other's comments as we go through the rest of this webinar. But what I'll do is just share with you a tip here, and this tip isn't specific to the scenario. It is very relevant regardless of what kind of cross-cultural negotiation situation you might come across. And here's the tip when it comes to understanding the business mindset. Learn the underlying motivators of the other culture. For example, how they communicate and how they build trust. So in this scenario, the advice that I might give to the Australian is to recognize that your Asian counterpart isn't just focused on this particular contracts like perhaps you are. They are also heavily focused on building a relationship. So my advice is that at this very early stage, you probably want to start investing in the relationship and showing your intent that you would like to do business with them for a long time to come. Now that's probably a change in thinking, because quite commonly in Australia, you tend not to invest too heavily in that relationship until you've met that milestone of getting a contract signed. The advice that I might give to the Asian is to acknowledge that the Australian probably is focused on getting the contract signed at this point in time, and to have a systematic process of negotiating. So therefore, when you start to continue to ask these questions without having the contract signed, you're likely to put the Australian offside, or certainly you might be getting the Australian worried about whether or not you're a serious buyer. So the advice to you at this point in time might be that you could consider either signing the contract if you are in a position to do so. You probably aren't, given that you haven't yet won that bid. But the other option that you might want to consider is offering a memorandum of understanding. At least that shows to your Australian counterpart that you are a serious buyer. So that's my tip for mistake number one. Mistake number two is setting unrealistic timeframes, and this can be a big cause of problems when it comes to cross-cultural negotiation. On this screen here, it's a bit of a cultural dimension that summarizes that in some cultures there is a heavy focus on the contract or getting the task done, whereas in other cultures there is a much stronger focus on relationship. So as we mentioned earlier, the Australian supplier in this particular scenario is heavily focused on the contract, but that means that they may be completely unaware that the primary objective of the Asian party is probably going to be on relationship buildings at this particular point in time. The other thing that they may not be aware of is that as the Asian is probably focusing on a relationship at the moment, it's going to be their relationship with their own client. So that's something to keep in mind. From the Asian perspective, they are, as I mentioned, pretty much focused on building long-term relationships. And when I say long-term, I often refer to the 20-year rule, and it goes something like this. If I can assess at this particular point in time that I can trust you well enough so that we can do business for the next 20 years, then I will continue investing in this relationship. If I don't see any future for the next 20 years, regardless of what the current contract is, then I may decide, no, this is not worthwhile investing in the relationship, and hence the negotiation deal may never even make it to the table. Now, the problem here is that the expectation of the Asian buyer is that the Australian supplier probably understands all of this, but that is not necessarily the case. So the question that I pose to you at this point in time is, what advice might you give to either party in relation to timeframes and milestones? And again, I'd invite you to put your comments into the chat section here. Let me share with you a few tips here. The first tip is to invest an appropriate amount of time to build the relationship. So to the Australian, I would suggest really keep in mind the 20-year rule here. Now, from an Asian perspective, I would suggest that an appropriate amount of time is really keeping in mind that the Australian is looking at getting that contract signed at an earlier stage rather than down the track. So, so at the best opportunity, try to either sign the contract or at least show some genuine sign that you are committed to this deal, and perhaps sign a memorandum of understanding. Now, the second tip here is to rein in your expectations for closing the deal quickly in Asia. This is obviously an advice that I would give to those of you who are outside of Asia. The reason that I say this is that decision-making frameworks are highly influenced by culture. And as a result, when it comes to Asian cultures, compared with many other cultures, the decision-making process tends to be much longer. One of the key reasons, of course, relates to what we've already discussed, which is about relationships. And as you know, relationships do not happen overnight. So, so the tip here is, yeah, don't expect that the deal is necessarily going to be closed as quickly as it might in your own country. Now, the third tip that I would give for those of you from Asia would be to rein in your expectations for flexibility when it comes to your Australian or to your other cultural counterparts. Now, the reason for this is, from an Australian perspective, negotiation has a standard step-by-step process, and once an agreement has been made, whether that's a verbal agreement, whether that's a contract, we tend not to look too favourably upon revisiting or constantly revisiting those agreements that have already been made. So if you are expecting that after the contract has been made, that you can continue making a whole lot of changes to the scope, you should expect that there will be consequences. And quite often those consequences are in the form of penalties, or they may be in the form of additional fees. So that's something to keep in mind when we think about timeframes and what the other person's timeframes may be. Let's move on to the last mistake that I'd like to share with you, which is being unaware of communication gaps. And really, this is probably the most common one that I come across. As an interculturalist, we tend to use a whole lot of different cultural dimensions to explain some of those cultural differences. But the one that I would like to share with you today is this cultural dimension of directness. Now, I've got 6 cultural dimensions on the screen. There are plenty more than that. I tend to use between about 6 and 8, depending on the scenario. But when it comes to directness, this has a high applicability when it comes to explaining some of these communication gaps. So let's have a look at this one. Directness. So in many cultures, for example, in Australia, there is a focus on being direct, and we often use the term being open and honest. So from the Australians' perspective in this scenario, their preference for communicating is to be open and honest. So that gives them a few options when it comes to this dilemma that the Australian has, as to they're not really comfortable to continue supplying information to the Asian buyer until the contract is signed. Number one, the option could be to explain that in a quite direct fashion. Of course, there is the risk that you end up losing face for your Asian partner. And then, of course, the other option is just to straight out say, no, I'm not going to supply any more information until we get that contract signed. But if you were to do that and you're dealing with an Asian partner, you will most likely sour that relationship. So that's something to keep in mind. From the Asian perspective, the preferred method of communication is being very diplomatic. So this has big implications. For example, if the Australian was to ask the Asian buyer, is everything okay? The Asian supplier will probably say yes, but what they're really meaning is no, there are some concerns that we have here. They will let you know this by some pretty indirect responses. So for example, it could be that they might just start pulling back in terms of their communication. They don't respond to emails or phone calls as quickly. And this is a more diplomatic way of explaining that, well, not everything is okay. The risk here is if that's their method of communicating with the Australian counterpart, possibly your Australian counterpart is not reading between the lines, because in cultures like Australia, reading between the lines is not something that is done to the same extent that it is in your Asian cultures. So the question that I would like to pose to you at this point is, what advice might you give to either party on how to communicate their concerns? So let me share with you again some tips as you are typing in your comments into the chat section. This is a tip for the non-Asians. Always remember that even under pressure, maintaining face is important in Asian cultures. Think twice before asking direct questions, because the answer is more often than not going to be yes, or a response that they are expecting you want to hear. So the advice that I give to the Australian is that if you are choosing to say no to your Asian buyer in response to their request for additional information, use a more diplomatic way that is going to avoid losing face. So you might use the phrase, "It is difficult. This could be difficult for us." So you're not directly saying no, but when you say that, your Asian counterpart will probably understand where you're coming from, particularly if you supplement this with other more subtle methods, like, again, perhaps not responding to those emails as quickly as you were earlier on. Another tip here is for the Asians, don't assume your Australian counterpart will read between the lines. Be comfortable with expressing your concerns. And the key point here is that if you are not explicit enough in explaining what is going on, there is a high chance that your counterpart, your Australian counterpart, for example, won't, number one, understand those subtleties, and number two, they may have no idea what your processes are or what you are trying to achieve in terms of your relationship with your own client at this point in time. That in turn leads to many opportunities for miscommunication and misunderstanding. So that brings us to the end of the mistakes. At this point, let's go back to that initial question that I posed to you. And the question was this: what advice would you give to either party so that they can negotiate the best outcome? I'm really curious to find out what your comments are. So keep them coming in the chat section. I'm going to hand it over to Patricia in a moment, but first of all, let me share with you what a suggested solution might be when it comes to providing this type of cross-cultural advice. Number one is to learn the underlying motivators of the other culture. It is really important to understand what their business mindset is, for example, their communication patterns and how they build trust. Number two, invest in an appropriate amount of time to build the relationship. As I've already mentioned, keep in mind, if you're an Australian and you're dealing with someone from Asia, keep in mind that 20-year rule. And conversely, if you're from Asia and you're dealing with someone from another culture, keep in mind that if they are from a culture where there's a systematic pattern of doing things, then getting the contract signed is probably a key thing that they are focused on. And you might want to, for example, offer a memorandum of understanding if you are unable to sign a contract early on in the piece. And then the third piece of advice is to balance diplomacy with directness. And we've just discussed this. Really important to be aware of those potential communication gaps. Don't assume that everyone has the same kind of communication preferences that you do. And if you only use those communication preferences or patterns that you're used to making, then you are possibly leaving yourself open to miscommunication and to potential problems down the track. So that's the suggested solution. Now, I am curious to find out what your comments are, and of course, if you have any questions. So at this point, I'll hand it over to you, Patricia.
Thanks, Craig. Really interesting tips and ideas that you've shared with us earlier. Thanks for that. We do have one question, which is quite appropriate to what you just pointed out on investing an appropriate amount of time to build relationship. The question was, would you suggest putting in more time when choosing the right partner? Is this something that Australians do less compared to Asian businesses?
Okay, so the question is, would you put in more time when choosing a partner?
Correct.
And in particular with Australia. Great question. And I wish more people would ask this question when they go into their cross-cultural negotiations. Just to clarify, in Australia or in any culture, there is, as part of negotiating, always an emphasis on establishing relationships. But the key thing here is that in Australia, we might typically not spend as much time on developing the relationship as someone from an Asian culture might. So, for example, when it comes to doing even let's say, for an Australian heading over to Asia to cut a business deal, if you're heading into Japan, for example, a typical Australian itinerary, or an itinerary might be this: you land on day one, you have your business negotiations on day two. During that time, you'll have a dinner with your client or your potential clients, and then by day three, you're back on the plane heading back to Australia. Now, what the Australian may not realise is that the time to build a relationship is going to be much longer, and this has direct implications in terms of how much time you want to spend with your potential client. So in Asia, what would typically happen is that in Japan, for example, day one, you don't actually even get to meet the client. Day one is for you to, I suppose, acclimatize, and the Japanese clients may suggest that you just have a bit of time for relaxing, and we'll meet you on day two. On day two, you might have, for example, a business lunch where you just talk about the generic relationship. You might be talking about things like, it would be great to do business for the long term, and that's probably about as much as what you're going to get in terms of the business part of the negotiation. The rest of that business lunch is focused on getting to know each other. Then when it comes to getting down to business, the tic-tacs of the negotiation, that may not actually happen until about day 4 or day 5 from an Australian perspective. Now that can be quite off-putting if you're used to going in there, having 1 or 2 dinners and assuming that that's enough to form a relationship. That just doesn't work that way in many Asian cultures. Any other questions or comments?
Great. Okay, we have another one asking about, you mentioned earlier on the term on maintaining phase. Could you please explain it a little bit more? And do you feel, or do you think that this maintaining phase or giving phase, it's more needed in certain Asian cultures compared to others?
Sure, it's fairly well recognized that maintaining or giving face is fundamental to most Asian cultures. Just to explain that term, if you are not familiar with it, it's basically causing embarrassment. And in the case of this particular scenario, if the Australian, for example, was to go to the Asian buyer and say, "Hey, look, we're not going to continue doing business with you until you sign the contract," that is a big opportunity for embarrassment on behalf of the Asian buyer. They may feel that they are being disrespected, and that that they end up feeling bad. It's always important to remember, it's not necessarily the things that you say, it's the way that you make people feel that they will remember. And that's a key part of negotiating, making sure that you are acknowledging people's feelings, and saving face is one of those key concepts. Saving face does happen in all cultures. It is much stronger in Asia. There are concepts of saving face, giving face, maintaining face, and to answer, I think the second part of your question, Patricia, was about how might you save face. Was that it? If you can just remind me.
The question was more towards maybe certain cultures in Asia are more. It's more important to save face and to give face as compared to others. What do you have any comments on that?
Okay, so my comment there is that absolutely, if you are dealing with anyone from an Asian culture, you really need to keep this top of mind at any point in time. And I'll give you a quick example. In Australia, when it comes to negotiations, we tend to be fairly informal. So a lot of negotiations may actually happen, for example, in a coffee shop. Even if it's in a boardroom, there's not necessarily a lot of emphasis on making sure that, that everyone is introduced by title. And even the seating arrangements may be fairly informal. Now, that is very different when it comes to the formal part of a negotiation in Asia. And what I have seen plenty of times when I've lived in Asia, when it comes to, let's say, for example, Australians or Americans coming in to negotiate or to win a contract deal, is that, they'll come in, they'll call people by their first name, and in other words, they're not really respecting the hierarchy that may be expected in this fairly formal negotiation situation. The Australian may sit down first, and they may just sit down wherever they think is the best spot, without taking into consideration that hierarchy and status is a fairly important part when it comes to doing business in Asia. So that may end up causing a loss of face. So that's a bit of an example.
Great. I can definitely relate to that coming from Asia. Okay, we have another question on language. Dealing with cross-cultural, multicultural, language is always something that is of a concern. So how important is language competency or fluency in cross-cultural negotiation? And if it's necessary for an interpreter, is it useful to have an interpreter in narrowing the gap? Because the interpreter probably will understand the culture a little bit more. And if so, would a partnership model work better than having it maybe as a service provider and a customer model?
Sure. So there are a few parts to that question. The first part was, is language important? So what my advice here is that if you can speak the language of the person with whom you're negotiating, of course, that is a massive advantage. Having said that, a lot of business negotiations may be in, for example, business English. And what happens even between, let's say, Australia and Singapore? So you're based in Singapore, Patricia. I used to live there as well. And, Singaporeans have a very good command of English. However, what can be quite tricky is that it's the style of communication, or those communication patterns that we mentioned earlier, that can be quite different. For example, a more diplomatic style of communication in Singapore is preferred over the more direct style in Australia. So just because someone speaks the same language as you and you can communicate in the same language, don't assume that you are not going to have any cross-cultural miscommunication, because it does happen quite frequently. But coming back to that initial question, is language important? Yes, it is important. If you can speak another language, that is fantastic. Another question you asked about is, should he get an interpreter? Now, coming back again to the scenario that we just mentioned, if you are an Australian and you are going into Asia to have a negotiation, particularly a big negotiation, and you don't speak the language of the people that you're meeting with, and they're not particularly confident with English, they may suggest an interpreter. You may want to bring along your interpreter as well. That's obviously going to be a good starting point. But what I would advise is also getting more of a cultural interpreter as well. So that may or may not be your language interpreter, but your language interpreter may not necessarily pick up some of those subtleties of the cultural nuances that are happening. For example, as an Australian, you sit down at the meeting table, and you might assume that the person in front of you is the power maker in this deal. But a cultural interpreter might be able to kind of whisper in your ear that, take a look at where those people are sitting. Although there may be one person who is the spokesperson, they may not necessarily be the decision maker, or they may not be the person calling the shots here. So having an interpreter is great. Having a cultural interpreter is more important, I would say, or equally as important. The last part of your question was about partnerships. You know, what kind of model might it be? Look, I can't really advise on that. It really depends on the situation. I know that the advice that I've given to a number of my clients in Australia who are negotiating or doing business with people in China, for example, I advise them to, and I recommend to them a few different translators who are both translators and cultural interpreters as well, and so what they do is they just engage them on a project by project basis to accompany them on their trips through to Asia.
Great, I really love the tip on the cultural interpreter. I think language interpreter is something that it's people do have, but sometimes, a lot of times, the cultural interpreter is really, really important to just bring us over that edge. Yeah. Okay, the next question we have, increasingly there's a great number of us either having teams internationally or having to negotiate internationally and using tools like video conferencing as opposed to face-to-face meetings. Are there any tips of communicating using video conference calls? Because you did mention earlier on in the presentation that of course, if possible, a face-to-face, it's more effective. But a lot of times we do need to rely on technology.
Absolutely, that is a great question and becomes more relevant every day as we become more globalized. In fact, even just to share with you personally, my own work, most of the coaching that I do nowadays is via webinar or via video conferencing. So my clients or the people that I work with are all around the world. I very rarely get to meet people face to face nowadays. So highly relevant question. The tip here is to keep in mind what we had mentioned earlier with regards to what's the cultural background of the people that are on your video conference or your virtual meeting, because that will have big implications in terms of their communication preferences. So for example, let's say in our meeting at the moment, we've got, I'm in Australia, I'm speaking with you, Patricia, you're based in Singapore, and we've got some of our PCMA colleagues over in America. We're all trying to discuss. Now, what may happen when it comes to a really important point or a heated argument where everyone's got lots of ideas is that, for example, the Americans may be very forthcoming in jumping in and sharing their ideas with passion, whereas you, from an Asian perspective, are probably more comfortable with sitting back and listening to what other people are saying, so that when you share your suggestion, it is something that is not going to cause you to lose face, something that you're not going to be embarrassed about. And so what you'll do is you will wait for a pause in the meeting for you then to jump in and to share your comments. However, on this webinar, we've got, on this video conference, we've got the Americans who are happily talking, and until they get interrupted, they may continue to talk. We might have some Italians on the call who are happy to kind of talk over each other. We've got people from other cultures who may end up kind of wandering in and out of the room. They might find it completely acceptable in their culture to be on the webinar and at the same time to be on the phone and at the same time taking notes or giving instructions to someone who is perhaps off screen. So you've got all of these things going on at once. It can be really chaotic. So my advice is that if you are chairing this meeting, number one, try to find out what that cultural background or those personal preferences are of the people that are going to be in the room. Number two is to set your expectations up front. And so when we're dealing with people who have got different cultural communication preferences, it can be simply a matter of saying at the beginning of your webinar to say, great that you're all here. We've got people from different cultural backgrounds, and so we all have our own expectations in terms of how we communicate. how much time it takes for us to build relationships with one another. But I'd like to share with you for this webinar, these are the rules. These are our expectations. We are going to spend the first 5 minutes just talking about getting to know each other. So we're allocating some time. For those of you who are from, for example, Australia, you may find that this, you may normally find that this is a bit of a waste of time, but please go with the flow. We've got people here from other cultures who find it really important to get to know each other. So let's, number one, spend 5 minutes to get to know one another. Then when it comes to our discussions, I would ask that we don't try to speak over one another. As a moderator, I will throw questions over to you. If you've got any comments, perhaps put them into the chat section, and I will come back to you. So Patricia, there's some practical tips in terms of running virtual meetings, particularly when you've got people from different cultural backgrounds on the meeting.
Great, thanks for that. One other question was, you mentioned that knowing local business etiquette is still important, but didn't really elaborate on that. Where can people like us find this type of information?
Sure. Look, my immediate response to that is Google is your friend. It is amazing how many online resources are out there, both on Google, on YouTube. So for example, for the Australian supplier, in this case, if they're heading over to China, my suggestion would be to do a search in terms of cross-cultural negotiation, Australians and Chinese. That might be one thing, and another thing might be just to find out a little bit about those cultural profiles of doing business in China. So there's a whole lot of really useful information out there if you're just looking for some fast and speedy insights. I would recommend, if you are negotiating or if you're doing business internationally quite often, then personally, I use a tool called Country Navigator. It's by TMA World, and it is a subscription tool, but it gives you access to over 90 different cultural profiles, and it goes into a lot more than just those do's and don'ts and business etiquette. It really can be quite helpful in terms of understanding the mindset of the people that you're dealing with. And for myself as an intercultural coach, I will use those cross-cultural tools that are available from Country Navigator as part of the coaching program that I do.
Great, thanks for that. I hope everyone has taken notes on where you can get the information from. We'll probably have time for one or two more questions. Let me see. Hi Craig, do you have any examples of cultural biases that commonly occur?
Look, cultural bias, one of the key things to keep in mind is that, or one of the common mistakes that happens is that we go in expecting that the other party has the same decision-making frameworks as us, the same communication techniques as us, hence the kind of problems that we saw in this scenario where the Australian is really focused on getting that contract with the assumption that the Asian party is either, number one, focused on getting the contract, or number two, they're not a serious buyer. They're perhaps what we refer to as a tire kicker. So my advice when it comes to cultural bias is to, number one, be culturally curious. Don't take things at face value. If you are in a situation where you find that your negotiating partner is behaving in a way that is perhaps, you might initially, your gut feel is that, oh geez, they're being rude or they're being disrespectful. Well, rather than jumping to the conclusion that they are rude or disrespectful or whatever the case is, pause and think to yourself, could there be a cultural reason that is driving this particular behavior, which from my cultural perspective appears to be rude or disrespectful? So that's number one, have that cultural curiosity and pause. Now, the second thing is it's really important to be aware of your own cultural expectations or what your own cultural standards are. as we mentioned earlier, one of those, the cultural preferences for Australians is to be open and honest in their discussions. This is something that we have learned from being young through until, you know, when we do our leadership courses, for example, you know, we're always told a good leader is someone who is open and honest and can have those courageous conversations with their team members. Now, I would like to add here, that is a highly culturally influenced philosophy there, because as we had a look earlier, that's not just necessarily the way that leadership works in many other cultures. So, yeah, the point here is to be aware of what your own cultural preferences are, and then that brings me to the third point, which is have a look at what, if these are your own cultural preferences, what are the cultural preferences of the other party, and if there are big differences, are there perhaps things that you need to do so that you can get out of your comfort zone, you can move beyond your comfort zone, so that you can perhaps, for example, be more indirect or more diplomatic in your approach, when deep down you're probably thinking, I just want to say what is on my mind. So yeah, that would be my tip.
Thank you for that. I think these are all great points. Cultural curiosity, having a cultural interpreter, understanding others is really important. That will help us to be aware, to be patient, you know, understanding ourselves in terms of cultural preferences as well as others. All great tips. Well, I just want to be very wary of everyone's time as well as your time. So Craig, thank you very much for this very insightful session. For those who've missed this earlier, Craig will be sharing this session again at AIME in Melbourne on the 18th of February. He was presenting a session as part of AIME's knowledge program, and PCMA is proud to be the strategic education partner at AIME. We will be posting all of this online so that you can go download it at any time that you want. All you have to do is, if you want to share this, all you have to do is just sign in, and you are free to watch this as many times as you like. I'd like to thank Craig once again for his time. Any final words for us before we close up?
Look, for those of you who are attending AIME, I would love to get to meet you face-to-face in Melbourne next month, either at the Knowledge Exchange or at the Ideas Academy on the second day. For all of you, I wish you all the best in your cross-cultural negotiations, and thank you very much for being here today. If you do have any more questions, or if you've got any comments, feel free to connect with me. I am always open to hearing what other people's views are. All of my details are here on the screen, either by LinkedIn, or you can go to the website alphacrane.com.au and send me a message there. I will be more than happy to return your call, or we can have a Skype catch up. But for now, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, and back to you, Patricia.
Thank you, Craig. And thank you to all our online participants tuning in from all over the world. I hope you've picked up some relevant learning points that can be put into practice on your scope of work, and look forward to your continued engagement with PCMA. Thank you.